First, we'll start with the shoulder joint. We have flexion and extension. This happens in the sagittal plane, which has a medial lateral axis. Then we have abduction and adduction. This happens in the frontal plane with the anterior posterior axis. And then we have medial and lateral rotation, which happens in the transverse plane with the longitudinal axis. The shoulders can also abduct and adduct horizontally, and this happens in the transverse plane with the longitudinal axis. Next, we have the elbow, which flexes and extends. Both these actions occur in the sagittal plane with a medial lateral axis. Next, there's the lumbar spine. You can rotate your spine, which happens in the transverse plane with the longitudinal axis. You can also laterally flex your spine on either side. This happens in the frontal plane with the anterior posterior axis. Next, we have the hip, which can flex and extend. These happen in the sagittal plane with a medial lateral axis. The hip also abducts and adducts. These happen in the frontal plane with medial lateral axes. The hip can also laterally and medially rotate. These happen in the transverse plane with a longitudinal axis. Now on to the knees, which can flex and extend also, and this happens in the sagittal plane with the medial lateral axis. I'm going to explain at every joint what's happening in a baseball swing. So, I'm swinging for the ball, and of course, it's a home run. You know it. So, I'm going to start with the legs, and in the starting position, the hip and knee are flexed, and my ankles are dorsiflexed, and all of these happen in the sagittal plane with a medial lateral axis. On the swing, both my hips and my knees are going to extend. This happens in the sagittal plane with the medial lateral axis, and just because my back foot is going to plantar flex. In the starting position, both my shoulders are slightly flexed, which happens in the sagittal plane, medial lateral axis. My right shoulder is medially rotated, which happens in the transverse plane with longitudinal axis, and my left arm is abducted, which happens in the frontal plane with the anterior posterior axis. Then, for the swing, my left shoulder is medially rotating while my right shoulder is laterally rotating. This happens in the transverse plane with the longitudinal axis. My elbows are extending. My elbows are extending, which happens in the sagittal plane with the medial lateral axis. And my spine is rotating, which happens in the transverse plane with the longitudinal axis. So, the swing and a homer. Once we know the joints and the movements they can make and the axes they occur in, we can easily break down any complex